Hello, thank you for joining us today. We are going to present on a training titled Maximizing the Value of Data in the District Attorney's Offices. Before we get started, just introduce ourselves. My name is Daniel Offlick. I'm a program manager with University of Pittsburgh's Program Evaluation and Research Unit.
And I am Glenn Hoffman, Manager of Data Analytics and Informatics with the Program Evaluation and Research Unit.
So PERU is conducting a prosecutorial decision-making research study in DA's offices. So not directly associated with our research, but an objective of our project is to use findings from preliminary audit of case management data to inform and improve the condition of data collection, management, analysis, and reporting in each DA's office. To that end, today's training will cover some key topics surrounding prosecutorial data lifecycle best practices. As you can see here, our learning objectives for the training to improve attendee confidence in collecting comprehensive data for all cases accepted by the DA's office, resolving errors in data they do collect, resolving errors in data collected by peers, interpreting data related to reports and using the results to inform work, and then communicating data in a way that reduces bias for their audiences. So before we get started on anything else, just some questions to think about for yourself. What data does your office currently collect? Do you know? If you don't know, who does? If you could collect any data about cases in your office, what would you collect? So in terms of defining data, what we mean by that is, as you can see here, units of meaningfully coded information. When we talk about data, people have lots of operating definitions of what that word means, some of which carry negative connotations. So big data, government is watching me, Facebook, Instagram is selling my profile information. So we want to start out the training very concretely that we are collecting data on the cases that their office processes, as well as the characteristics of those cases. So people accused and charged with committing a criminal offense, and the process involved of collecting and processing that data.
And so one thing that we want to start out here with is talking about why do we care about data, right? And we just kind of defined what we're talking about when we're talking about data specifically. But now I want to talk a little about data culture, which is a kind of a broader concept than just talking about quantitative or qualitative data, but rather the approach that a individual or an organization takes to data overall, like their approach to how they're going to engage with the idea of data in the course of doing their work. And by building a strong data culture, or basically just taking a really data-focused approach to work, we can accomplish a lot of useful things, such as improving the efficiency and quality of work performance, which can lead to the prevention of lost time due to legal disputes, and ultimately increase cost effectiveness. And lastly, by really embracing data and a data culture, you can create a lot of value for research, and not just research like that that we are conducting as a university entity, but also research within your organization, within your office, to look into indicators of your own work performance to make sure that you are not only being just in your decision making, but also improving the effectiveness and efficiency of your work. And so now we'll take a quick look at two different examples of weak data culture and strong data culture. So on the weak side, a good example of this would be risk assessment algorithms. And in particular, there's a study in 2006 that started in 2016, a report that came out through a ProPublica group that looked into a risk assessment algorithm that at the time was used across most of the country, and the developers of it suggested that it was a fair, unbiased assessment of risk that could be used to inform bail and sentencing decisions without concerns about utilizing race, gender, ethnicity, or other demographic characteristics as indicators of risk, right? And so they suggested that race was not utilized. And it was true if you just read the assessment and what was written there. However, a number of other data points acted as proxies for race due to the institutionalized barriers and of course institutional racism and prejudice that has been kind of baked into the culture of the United States for centuries, really. And so, for example, they utilize questions about whether or not the individual had friends or relatives who had previously been incarcerated. Well, knowing that Black individuals are incarcerated at a higher rate than white individuals, that's going to bias the result of the algorithm, placing Black individuals into a higher risk category. Also, some less obvious factors at play were questions like whether or not the individual grew up in a single parent household, or whether or not they had ever been suspended from school or received detention. In the case of the school indicator there, we know that Black individuals and individuals of color more broadly are more likely to be punished more harshly and have that punishment documented in in primary and secondary schooling. And so again, it's another likely unintentional, but still a bias within the algorithm that ultimately caused it to disproportionately identify Black individuals as high risk, leading to a higher rate of pretrial confinement and also longer sentences for those individuals. Now, you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with a data culture? Well, on the part of the developers of the algorithm, had they taken a more comprehensive approach to the development of the algorithm, they might have thought maybe we should consider the context of the variables that we're using here and not just the binary understanding of do they have this indicator? Yes, no. Okay, that puts them into a different category. Had they contextualized some of that information, perhaps they would have realized that they were using a number of indicators that acted as proxies for essentially creating a racially biased algorithm. Additionally, on the side of the offices utilizing this algorithm, if they had a strong data culture locally, they might have been able to monitor their data and see, oh, wait, look at this trend, look at what's going on here. We need to dig into this and figure out why these risk assessments are biasing the results, right? And so that's really where the idea of data culture can come in, both locally and on that more national scale through the development process of the algorithm. Now, for a great example of a strong data culture, so the Philadelphia Data Lab was established in 2016 with the charge of increasing transparency and really improving the county's whole approach to data. So it was established by within the district attorney's office, and they kind of took a multi-pronged approach, but two really key tactics that they took to address the data culture. So first off, they improved transparency and accountability through the development of multiple public-facing data dashboards. We're actually going to take a look at one of those pages later on. And then they also informed the development of two policies that decrease racial disparities in community supervision sentence length. And how the data lab played into this is they worked a lot to just improve the quality of the data being collected to inform this community supervision sentence length policy, right? They were able to bring it to the forefront by providing high quality data in close to real time so that the decision makers within the local government could actually understand what is happening and act upon that information and feel confident in those decisions. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the data lifecycle, and this will tie back into the Philadelphia Data Lab and sort of their approach to data culture. But before we dive in, just want you to think a little bit about what the data lifecycle might look like within your office, or just what that means in general to you. So the data lifecycle, which was originally developed by IBM for software development, provides a useful framework for visualizing the role of data both within your office and across all sorts of industries. Pretty much any industry that utilizes data, which is all industries, there's some aspect of a data lifecycle that's utilized, right? And so the model that you see on the right-hand side is a fairly general model that can really apply to a variety of different areas. But the one useful part of it that I think kind of really stands out versus the standard data lifecycle is the blue arrow that creates that cyclical design. And that allows us to really consider the fact that data, it's not just just a linear path where we collect our data, we analyze it, and then it just gets stored somewhere forever. Really, we want to be able to improve the ways in which we collect, manage, analyze, and report our data over time so that we're always providing more effective, efficient services and making better use of, ultimately of taxpayer dollars, right? And so today we'll talk about all four of these sections a little bit, but the majority of what we're going to focus on will be the first two, because without strong data collection and management, we really can't even have a conversation about analysis or reporting.
So we're going to start with collection and data validation. So talking about comprehensive data collection. It's obvious that every district attorney's office is unique, so that in its structure, staffing, and capacity for data collection about what's achievable, what's not achievable. However, a study by Olson and other colleagues in 2018, which has since been supported in part by other publications and studies, identified 3 key data areas that are listed here for all prosecutors' offices to focus data collection efforts on. Right, so the aggregate case flow metrics that are depicted on the left are suggested as the easiest to collect, while case details and data on those decision-making points as you move to the right are a little more difficult for offices, especially in more rural or underfunded parts of the country. However, the majority of offices should be able to collect at least one metric from each of those decision-making points. So charging, bail, diversion, plea offers, and sentencing. Usually, ideal scenario would be that priority is placed on those areas most important to the local community, or to areas that are really important for your office and regionally. So an example would be if your county has a robust diversion environment with a range of diversionary programs for individuals, that might make diversion a likely candidate and focal point for more rigorous data collection.
So another really important thing when it comes to data collection is having required data entry and required data formats. So requiring field completion can ensure that our key values are present for all records. So this is something like IDs, right? If we have multiple different tables within our data system, we want to make sure that we have a consistent, unique identifier that we can use to connect all records across our entire system. And standardizing our field types can reduce the likelihood of human error. In particular, this is useful for things like dates, phone numbers, email addresses, and as I mentioned before, ID fields. So, for example, if we require that all phone numbers have the appropriate number of digits and follow a consistent format, we can really prevent any lost information or lost communication with an individual. Date fields as well, even coming down to the actual format of that date. For example, using dashes versus forward slash or backward slash, right? Having all of those things spelled out. And ideally, these required data entry and format pieces are going to be integrated into your actual case management system, and not just as a policy or standard operating procedure, because we all make mistakes, and that's something that we should expect. Along the same lines are domain values. And domain values, which you may hear referred to as list values or just validation in general, are a set of predefined values that can be selected from for a given field. And what this allows for, it allows us to prevent human error, and not more importantly, but just as importantly, it saves time during data entry and also during data analysis. So an example of this is in one data set that we audited for this project, we came across a case status field. And within this case status field, Rule 586 had the three different formats that you see here, right? One with all capitals, one with sentence case, and one with all lowercase. Now you might think, that's okay, it all says Rule 586. While that's true, there are two key issues here. First of all, if I'm trying to quickly look through this data, I may rely on the records for all caps Rule 86 and not even notice the others. Or if this is being used for an automated report or something like a data dashboard, it may only pull one of those Rule 586s. Many programming languages are case sensitive, and so they would identify each of those as unique values. And that could lead to inaccurate reporting or even result in some data being lost because it's excluded from a data set, whether for reporting or for analysis. And so I will say these past two, this slide and the previous slide, these things may require collaboration and coordination with your case management vendor. However, there are some things that we can do today or within the next week to start working towards a stronger data culture in your office. The first thing is documenting how we enter data. And so documenting the data entry process allows others to replicate your workflow. However, an important distinction here is that we want to document the actual process. Many times people will say, oh yes, we have a policy for that, we have a procedure for that, but it doesn't actually reflect what they do in their day-to-day. And so when you have a new staff person or someone who may be filling in while another staff person is out of the office, they're not able to actually replicate the work because there are assumptions or special considerations that someone just knows as institutional knowledge, which may be fine, but can cause a lot of issues when that institutional knowledge is not available. And when we're developing any of these protocols, we want to make sure that they're accessible in the course of doing our work and are easy to comprehend. So for example, rather than putting something into a Word document that someone prints out and then has at their desk, maybe we should instead create a tab. If you're collecting data in a spreadsheet, for example, maybe we should create a tab within that spreadsheet that is an instructions or protocol tab that just lists everything out step by step right there. So then no matter what, if you're collecting data in that form or entering data in that form, you have the procedure for how to use that form, right? So it's in the course of doing work and really doesn't add any additional burden to me to be able to follow the procedure protocol word for word. And so now we'll still stick with collection a little bit, but we're going to move a little into data management and talk about some internal controls. So first off, peer review and dual authorization. So anyone who has a financial background, you're probably very familiar with both of these, and you'll be familiar with most of the internal controls. But similar to a lot of the information that you all work with, obviously in the financial industry, things need to be extremely accurate, and we want to make sure that we have appropriate checks in place to ensure the completeness and accuracy of what we are recording. And so ideally, we want that to be done across all records by a second staff member. Now, I understand this is the real world. Funding, staffing, all sorts of issues may restrict the ability to do that. But there are some options, right? One solution, you can create a standard sampling plan, right? For example, you could say we're going to review 10% of all records that are entered. Alternatively, you could say that you're going to review a certain volume of cases in a given frequency of time, right? So for example, you might say every month we're going to review 100 cases. Or if, for each staff person that we have available, we're going to review 40 cases, right? So then you're able to adjust that review burden based on the capacity of your staff, right? So it's a little more flexible versus just saying, oh, it needs to be 10%. We have one staff person rather than 3, so now they're burdened with a ton of work, right? But ultimately, we just want to make sure that there is some amount of review so that we can be confident in the data that we are collecting and storing. Another useful internal control is to have a dedicated data entry team. So direct data entry should be restricted to a small group of staff who have received specific data entry training. Now, this may look a little bit different depending on your office, staffing, etc. But ideally, we want to have that consistent group that can develop a protocol, again, of what actually happens in the workplace, not just the ideal, and then pair those two things together to make sure that we have a very nice, consistent, well-oiled machine when it comes to data entry. And this group can also get together during recurring meetings to kind of have case review or sort of like a case study, right? To look through what are the errors that we're seeing frequently, what are the things that we need to all be aware of in that data entry process. And it helps through internal learning of that group, it helps them to really improve over time and become very effective at their data entry work. Speaking of, when it comes to that record review, like I said, we can have that team regularly get together, review cases, talk about challenges and improvements, and really work towards the ideal when it comes to data entry efficiency. Also, you can engage with students, interns, or nonprofit and academic institutions for more robust case studies, right, where they might take a larger sample of cases and go through the actual case records and look for opportunities for improvement, or for, time-saving opportunities, things like that. And it's just a good way, especially when it comes to students and interns, right? A good way to engage with the community as well and improve some of those pieces when it comes to transparency and community engagement. All right, so now we're going to fully dive into data management. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the idea of a data transition plan. So something to think about is, has your office ever changed over to a new data system, whether that be a new case management system or an entire new IT infrastructure? How did that go? Did everything work out? Was it a flawless process? I would reckon a guess that it probably was not a flawless process. And so it's really important that anytime you're having a change in your hardware or software, or even just a change in your office design, your organizational design, that we create a transition plan for our data to make sure that nothing is lost and that we are just as or more effective after the transition as we were before. So first off, we want to make sure that we document the current condition. And the reason that this is so important is that a lot of times when organizations go through periods of change with their, especially with software, they'll say, oh, well, this is going to improve our operations and make us lean, mean data collecting machines. And then after the transition, they say, oh, well, we still have all of these flaws. Well, unless you have strong documentation of what was happening before, it's really difficult for you to actually tell if there's been a positive or negative change after a transition, right? And so we want to document the data lifecycle, what happens to data within our organization, how is it stored, where is it stored, and what are the current issues, and what data are currently missing from the information that we have, right? And when possible, we want to quantify those things so that then after the transition, we can determine, right, is there a quantifiable improvement in our data culture, right? So from there, we also want to make sure that we back up and crosswalk our existing data. Right. So before transitioning to new data technology, all records should be backed up in a format that is easy to access. And that is key, that it is easy to access. Having hard copy case records in filing cabinets for the past 2 decades is not a format that is easy to access. We want to have a digital format of that data that can easily be restored if something happens to go wrong during the transition. Also, you want to evaluate the new technology that's going to be implemented to make sure that all of your existing data elements can be transferred over. And that may require some amount of consultation with your IT department or with someone who has a strong understanding of database management and or software development. But that can prevent a lot of issues, especially because working with vendors who may be private industry companies, of course, they want to market their product, and that's great. But we also want to make sure that that tool is truly going to be the most effective platform for your office. And then after the transition, we should make sure that we perform a quantifiable quality check for accuracy and completeness, right? And this is whether it's a transition in technology or personnel, the same rules apply here, right? We still want to make sure that the quality of our data is as good or better after we make that transition. And this is something that you can integrate into those record review meetings, case studies, or collaborations with outside institutions if you want it to be a little more robust, right? If you're changing over to a new software system, you may not have the capacity internally to do a full-blown audit of your data sets. So you might need to work with an outside entity to come in and assist with that. So now we're going to move into arguably the more interesting part of today's training and talk about data analysis. And most of this will focus on data visualization and a little less on the actual analytical methods or statistical methods. So the first concept I want to talk about is making data visible. And you might say, well, that's obvious to me, or you might say that's not really my job. Well, we want to, again, embrace a strong data culture in our office. And within that, you should think of data and data culture as kind of everyone's job. Everyone has a role to play in it, even if it's not designing the actual data visualizations or data dashboards themselves, right? And equipping all of you with some of this basic understanding of things to consider when developing data visualizations or developing data products is really key to making sure that when you have those conversations with the person whose role it is to develop those things, you could be better informed and come to them with a better initial concept. So easily accessed data visualization allows us for faster detection of errors, empowered decision-making, and greater transparency. Now, remember, I mentioned earlier, we need to have that high-quality data initially, right? We need that really high-quality, comprehensive data set, because if we get to this point and we make our data visible, it can be a double-edged sword in the sense that on one hand, it can be really helpful, increase transparency, improve engagement with the community. But if that data is inaccurate, that can be a problem, right? So we just want to remember and reference back to that idea of making sure that our initial data is really high quality. So I do have 3 different examples here, and we'll just talk about one. We're going to pull up the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office data dashboard. As I mentioned before, this was developed by the data lab within the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. And as you can see, there are a variety of different things that you can dive into here. But what we're going to talk about is just this available reports. We'll just look at charges here. And so this is just going to pull up some information on charges, and you can see it's year to date through yesterday. They provide some data definitions and limitations. Very important, right? Because that's how we can explain any caveats or special considerations, right, that people need to consider when they're looking at this information. And then from there, you're seeing a couple different visualizations having a geographic piece, some time series trends here, and then some tabular data to kind of add that context to what they're seeing up above here. And again, this is something, they've introduced some additional tools to filter by offense category and things like that. But it's really done a lot in terms of improving the visibility of data to the general public. And then they, of course, also have internal dashboards for the district attorney's office that helps to inform all of their internal processes and to improve the ways in which they conduct their work.
So Glenn already sort of mentioned this, and Philadelphia is a good example, but having that visible data strengthens relationships. So those can be relationships within your district attorney's office, within various court systems, but also externally with community groups and other organizations in the community and stakeholders who could benefit from having that information at their fingertips, right? So that public availability really increases transparency, but it also helps everyday citizens in your area or your county have a much better understanding of the local criminal justice system and who makes decisions at various points within that system and what are the outcomes happening on the ground, so to speak.
So additionally, when we create this strong data culture and we start kind of putting that information out there and demonstrating that you have a high quality data culture within your office, it draws attention, right? And it draws attention of research organizations along with government entities as well. And this can lead to additional funding opportunities, research projects, and state or federal recognition.
So now reporting and how we communicate data. So first and foremost, knowing your audience, right? So we'll review a couple important concepts around reporting data and how knowing your audience is applicable. So understanding that most of you are probably unlikely to create data reports or web-based dashboards. However, most of you probably will be asked to review, interpret, or contribute to data reports or dashboards, and so have a say in what those look like or what data is included. So before that begins, it's really knowing who you're trying to communicate with. Many data products are created with very little to no understanding of the target audience. And this leads to data products that really fall flat and are left either unread, underutilized, emails that aren't open, dashboards that aren't used in any way, shape, or form. So it's important to think about what matters most to your audience and the folks that you're targeting with this data, and then what language is appropriate for communicating with that audience. So what are those limitations, as Glenn cited? How do you use language that really summarizes those limitations in a way that people will understand who do not necessarily need a law degree or very intense experiences with criminal justice systems and legal proceedings. So jargon and excessive acronyms can really cause audiences to disengage and look elsewhere for information that may or may not be totally accurate.
Additionally, we want to try to limit misinterpretation and bias in any of our reporting. So an ideal approach is to have a third party review any data being reported, and ideally someone who has a little or no understanding or kind of frame of reference for the product, right? So ideally someone outside of the office, and just having them take a look at it and say, you know, does this make sense? Or better than that, have them summarize back to you what the report is actually saying and what the general takeaways are. Now, I understand that's oftentimes not going to be possible given tight deadlines, confidentiality concerns, other things like that. But even if you're only going to review it yourself, just ask yourself, if I didn't work in this office, would I understand this report or dashboard? And also just what are the takeaways that someone's going to get out of this if they don't have the institutional knowledge that you have? So additionally, we want to talk a little bit about equity considerations when it comes to data visualization. And so first off, I'm just going to talk about general data visualization designs. This is when we're talking about our bar charts, our line charts, our maps, our pie charts, right? All of which can be very useful tools for communicating information. However, we also need to make sure that we are representing our data appropriately. And so one thing right off the top is that we always want to make sure that we provide a comparison to the whole population. And what I mean by that is if we are looking at individuals who are charged with a certain offense, then we also need to understand the total population within a given area that could have potentially been charged with that offense, If we are looking at a certain demographic group, we need to know how many people of that demographic group exist within the total population, right? And so just always thinking through what additional information does someone need to draw fair comparisons. This is, of course, of particular concern when we talk about race, when we talk about gender identity, things like that, where our proportions of each group are not going to be equal. So we need to make sure that we give fair comparisons by looking at the proportion compared to the general population, right? And then additionally, we really want to pay close attention to our color schemes. And for this, I'll point to the visual on the right here. And I just want you to look at this for a few seconds and think about what might be a concern with this color palette here. And so you may have noticed, right, we have a couple different issues going on here. So first of all, we have these darker, more intense colors being associated with greater levels of poverty, right? And suggesting that that is a negative thing to be experiencing a higher degree of poverty, right, or a lower income situation. Additionally, we have being quote unquote more Black being associated with these dark negative colors as well. And then most importantly, one of the biggest issues here is that we have this association between being Black and being poor, suggesting that if you are more Black, you are more poor. And this just is a really inappropriate way to visualize this information, and suggest a fairly like obvious bias when it comes to race and poverty here. Now, I will mention the original product, the Besendal 2020 that is referenced here. They did go back, so this was pulled out into a product put together by the Urban Institute, kind of noting that it was a poorly visualized data product. And the original author did go back and adjust that. So if you do look into this, you'll find that they've adjusted that resource and utilized an improved visualization style. But you just always really want to think about color schemes and think about how someone might look at it and interpret preference, whether or not it is intentional. Also, lastly, here with the visualization style, we want to label things with purpose. For example, you may want to order your labels in descending or ascending order in terms of value, right? If we have 10, 5, 4, and 3, we could order them right based on those numeric values. Or you could go with something like alphabetical, right? Just having some intentional strategy with how we label things in data visualization is really important, because otherwise we may, whether intentionally or unintentionally, imply some sort of preference or priority if we just order things how they exist when we get the data out of a data system, or in a just kind of the historically accepted way of ordering things. An example of this is the kind of historic gender norm within the United States of ordering male, female, right? Well, in many cases, that's not actually going to make sense. And in visualization style, it may make more sense to order it alphabetically. And I, of course, am applying this binary assumption there. And when it comes to gender identity, of course, we want to be inclusive of all gender identities. But again, the historical binary sort of stereotype within the United States is the male-female listed in that order, and that oftentimes is not appropriate because, for example, if you had a larger female population than male, and you still ordered it in that same male-female order, it just doesn't have any clear association with purpose, right? And so we just always want to be mindful of how we're labeling our data visualization. Also, kind of along those similar lines, right, when it comes to being inclusive with our language and icons, we want to really be mindful of even things that might be used as sort of side images or just to add a little bit of visual interest to, for example, a slide in a slide deck. Even though it may seem like a kind of a side element, we want to make sure that they are as inclusive as possible. And many companies are still kind of working to improve on this. For example, the icon on the left here has this binary kind of assumption in terms of gender roles here with the in terms of the dress, and is really just supporting this binary approach to identity. And that is what you will find if you search for group of people in the Microsoft icon, the icon finder with the icons that are available. Possibly a better option is what you're seeing on the right here, that is a clearly more inclusive and introducing some additional elements. Obviously, they're still just blue and yellow, but definitely demonstrating a more diverse group of individuals on the right than on the left. Also, we want to make sure that we're utilizing people-first language. And for example, we want to think about things in terms of someone experiencing an event versus someone having their identity embedded within or defined by an event. So referring to someone as a detainee versus an individual who has been detained, right? Or prisoner versus incarcerated individual, or a person experiencing incarceration, right? Suggests that it is something that they are experiencing, not something that defines that individual.
And one of the more important pieces of equity when we talk about data and visualization is incorporating and valuing lived experience. So it's really vital to engage the community and individuals with lived experience and diverse perspectives in that data visualization and reporting process. So really no one can understand the data better than those who are impacted by it or those whose experiences are really represented by the data. So this is also a really important factor when we talk about improving relationships with the community and other populations, especially those that have been negatively impacted in the past. And it can really end up leading to a final product that is just more useful and relevant for the target audience and the community at large to engage in these data visualization tools, dashboards, whatever those final products may be.
All right, so thank you for sticking with us, and just a few key takeaways for today. We want to make sure that we establish standardized data collection fields and processes to produce high quality, useful data. And we can improve upon that through peer review, team case review, and some external case studies to identify opportunities for improvement in our data collection and management. And once we have that nice comprehensive data set, we can provide easy access to impactful data for internal and external stakeholders through intuitive visualizations and also inclusive visualization. And we want to make sure that we engage community members and individuals with diverse lived experience in the data analysis and reporting process and take their feedback seriously and utilize that to improve the quality of not only our data visualization and reporting, but that entire data culture within your office. Thank you for your time and have a great day.